Okay. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Tony, who is the bankruptcy examiner at Lehman Brothers. And I've invited Tony today to talk to us about what happened at Lehman. And he'll finish off with some words of wisdom as well about what we can take away from this case. So Tony, just as by way of introduction, could you talk to us about why Lehman failed and what was your role as the bankruptcy examiner?
Why did Lehman fail? Lehman failed for a number of reasons. The immediate reason was lack of liquidity in September of 2008 and the lack of confidence that lenders had in Lehman Brothers, which prevented it from going forward in financing transactions. It was stuck on its balance sheets with a whole series of illiquid assets, and it had not been able, over the course of the summer when people were scrutinizing its balance sheet, been able to find somebody to whom they could either sell those assets or to whom they could merge, and they had no exit strategy. So ultimately, all those comes together, and on the eve of an earnings statement, the market starts looking at it and says, we don't think they're going to survive. The lenders pull. They are unable to get their financing for repos, their overnight financing. Liquidity is gone. They come in on September 14th with the federal government. Nobody's prepared to buy them out. End of story. Now, how does this happen? You are looking at a firm that had among the world's greatest accountants, among the world's best law firms outside, extraordinarily talented people who were on the inside, double degrees from Oxford and Harvard or USC, you name it. Scrutiny by the SEC, who were on the premises from at least for about a year, as long as with the Federal Reserve. How does that happen? It happens as a result of some very conscious decisions made about 18 months before to bet that the crisis which was taking place in the mortgage market would not go from residential to commercial. And so they loaded up on commercial real estate, believing that they would beat the market at that particular point. And they went from being a moving company, meaning someone who packaged deals and took a fee, to a storage company. And they put assets that they could not liquefy in a short term. And when the liquidity crisis hit, they were unable to meet their obligations. That's how it happened. Conscious decisions made by extraordinarily talented people with the advice and counsel of great outsiders. Bad decisions.
Right, right. And could you talk to our students? Our students are auditing students, so they may not be at the moment so familiar with repo transactions, how they work in the market, and what the appropriate accounting is for those transactions. So could you talk to us a little bit about that and how Lehman used the repo transactions to actually understate its leverage?
Well, one of the responsibilities I had as the examiner, court-appointed examiner, which is an extraordinary position, essentially to have the authority of federal court to go out and find out how and why things happened, was the ability to gather up documents from multiple sources, including accountants, lawyers, and the company. And one of the things that came up late in the game was this issue of Repo 105, which we had never heard of and no one was discussing publicly. And when we focused on it, we became very, very concerned about it. And I'll tell you a backstory, which you may or may not want to share with your students, but the backstory is simply this. Two of our young associates were out doing an interview and talked to somebody who the federal government had talked to, who was a whistleblower. And he said that he had reported to the accounting firm here that Lehman was manipulating its balance sheet by using something called Repo 105 to make their balance sheet look better. The federal government simply didn't believe him. When they reported to me that we were told that as much as $50 billion a quarter was being removed from Lehman's balance sheet in order to make their leverage numbers look good, I found that hard to believe that everybody would have missed that. So I sent them back out, and they came back and showed me emails which were internal to Lehman Brothers, which described the Repo 105 transactions as shams, as creative and accounting gimmicks, ways to make our balance sheet look better than it really was, in essence, a fraud. So what was it? Repo transactions are the heart of what the investment banks use to finance their operations. Standard repo transaction is simply, I will pledge you my securities. In return, you will give me cash. And in return, in a set period of time, maybe 24 hours, you will return the securities. I will return your cash with a slight amount of interest and or payment, typically 1%, maybe 2%. So they're overnight financing. And the magnitude of those financings was approximately tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars through the industry, tens of billions of dollars every night for Lehman Brothers. That's why they kept the shop going. They would be accounted for as financings, which meant that they were not sales. They were financing, and that's how the assets and the liabilities would remain on the balance sheet. So they did not impact leverage. In 2008, critical questions were coming up about Lehman Brothers. This is after Bear Stearns had hit the skids. Two questions, liquidity and leverage. And Lehman was looking for a way to lower its leverage. Secretary of Treasury Geithner told me they had two ways in which they could do that. They could sell stock and do a financing, increase their monies that way, or they could sell assets. The problem with selling assets was if you have illiquid assets that are marked by your internal accountants and your outside accountants at a certain number, and you go to sell them, and the price you get for that marked asset is significantly lower than what you had it marked, not only does the street make notice of the fact that you overpriced it and wasn't worth that, but they immediately suspect that everything else in your portfolio is similarly overmarked. So you couldn't do it. That was Secretary Geithner's analysis of what had taken place with Lehman. So Lehman couldn't lower its leverage by either of those two ways, so they found another way to do it. That was called Repo 105. And if you'd want, I'll explain how they got into Repo 105.
Yeah, if you could. I mean, the 5 comes from the size of the haircut, right, that you mentioned earlier. Correct. And they use that haircut size to try and argue that the appropriate accounting was under FAS 140 and that these transfers of securities could be recorded as sales rather than as collateralized borrowing. So could you just explain a little bit more about that? How did they justify that based on the accounting standards? How did they convince the auditors to go along with this?
Well, it's a two-part answer to that. First of all, the standard that was used in order to record something as a sale, as a Repo 105 as a sale, was as a result of the accounting standards themselves, and the auditors did not review each transaction in terms of compliance with that. What they did was they reviewed initially Lehman's advice to its personnel as to how these matters should be accounted for. And the auditors looked at it and said, well, if in fact they meet all of these particular criteria, what you've set forth in your internal memo, they could be appropriately accounted for as a sale versus a financing. So all the accountants would say they did was in their dialogue with Lehman say, yes, that process is the appropriate process. They did not say, they claim, that every transaction that you're doing is appropriate, simply that that process is an appropriate process. So they distance themselves in that regard. What Lehman needed to do in order to have these transactions accounted for as a sale is they had to find a jurisdiction which would conclude that it did constitute a sale. They could not find a law firm in the United States that would opine that the transactions that they proposed would constitute a sale in the United States. But they did find that under British law, it could constitute a sale under British law. So what they did was simply this. At the beginning of each quarter, particularly the latter part of 2007 into 2008, they would, in essence, do a wash sale with their London subsidiary to the tune of $50 billion worth of securities. They would then go and execute Repo 105 transactions in Britain, the 5% vigorish on top, and they record then on taking those circumstances, they would have removed it both from the books in America and the books in Britain, and so they had an opportunity now to, in essence, take $50 billion in assets off of their books. At the end of the quarter, after their financial statements were published, they would simply reverse the transaction, and the assets would miraculously reappear on the books in the United States. The significance of that was stunning. At a time when Lehman was in a situation where they're reporting for the first time in their history losses on their books, the only positive thing they could refer to was the fact that their leverage had dropped. And the impact of the Repo 105 transactions was dramatic. Their internal accountants said that a movement of 1/10 of a point in the leverage was a material move. By doing what they did, they were moving they were dropping the leverage numbers by 1.8%, a massive number, reported by the Wall Street Journal and everybody else, as indicating that Lehman was taking care of its problems. But they were doing so by using an accounting gimmick, not by, and in fact, cleaning up their balance sheets.
Yeah, and part of Lehman's motivation for doing that was to avoid a drop in its credit rating. Is that right?
Credit rating, their sales, their stock. Most of the people within the corporation were paid the larger part of their bonuses, which totaled billions of dollars, was in stock. So the stock price was very much impacted by the issue of leverage and liquidity. They had triggering mechanisms with regard to their loan transactions and on the leverage issue. And beyond that, you had the issue of the regulators were breathing down their neck.
Right, and wasn't it the case also that Lehman tried to argue that the accounting for the securities as sales was appropriate because the haircut was so large? I seem to recall in your report you said that the haircut was 5%, and Lehman argued that as a result of that they couldn't use all of the money that they borrowed to repurchase those securities, and so that meant they no longer had effective control over those securities. Is that right?
That was their argument, and we really never got into whether or not this did or did not constitute an appropriate application of Repo 105 to the transaction. The heart of our statement, and reason why we concluded, among other things, that the accountants had exposure and liability here, was that the financial statements were misleading. They were misleading because, in fact, these transactions internally were being described as gimmicks, as accounting gimmicks, as a drug they were on in order to do what they're doing. And when we went to the various rating firms and said, did you know they were doing this? The answer was uniformly no. What would you describe this as? And every one of the agencies said to us, we describe that as fraud. And had we known that, we would have taken a different look at the ratings and how we would have viewed them. So to anybody stepping outside of their little closet and looking at that, they say, well, this is nothing more than a gimmick. This is not this transaction. The purpose of this transaction, whether it's technically correct under accounting rule, is to mislead the public as to the condition of your balance sheet, which is exactly what it did.
Right. I've actually had a debate about this with another professor, and the other professor who actually was a witness in this case, Professor Palmrose. And her perspective is, as long as the accounting does not represent a clear violation of GAAP, then the auditor should suffer no liability. But your perspective was somewhat different from that, right? Because you put emphasis on the fair presentation of the financial statements rather than whether or not there's a clear violation of existing GAAP.
Well, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals would disagree, I think, respectfully with your colleague.
Well, I disagree with her as well, which is why I'm asking you. I know that we both agree on this.
Well, I'd like to have the Second Circuit on my side in that debate, since they decide what the law is. Yeah. But the Second Circuit has very, very much said, question, is this really a fair presentation of their financial condition? When you get done, whether it's technically correct, is this a fair presentation? And everybody that you would talk to on the outside, I don't care if it's a reporter for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, a citizen on the street, people in a conversation. I've spoke to a conference with nothing but CEOs in there, described the transaction. There wasn't a CEO in the room who would defend the transaction or how way it was accounted for. They said, well, that sounds like fraud.
Yeah.
So there are technical arguments to be made, but the reality of it is, if you're not fairly presenting what the balance sheet really is, if you're not talking about whether these transactions, their timing, and the magnitude of these transactions has an impact on how the presentation takes place, you are ignoring the reality of what's taking place here. And I think accountants are being held to a standard that they can't do that. Now, in this particular case, there was another aspect, which, to be fair, we need to say. The accountants were alerted by a whistleblower to the claim that he was making that these transactions were solely being executed for purposes of manipulating the balance sheet and the presentation on the quarter. And they were charged with following up to determine whether that was the case. And they dropped the ball, to be blunt about it. They did not report back to the audit committee. They began, quote unquote, an investigation. They never got back. But in the meantime, financial statements were being published. So we held them responsible, at least in large part, for their failure to do what they were required to do with the audit committee, their failure to follow up, failure to review in the light of those whistleblowers things. So that was a significant part of our conclusion that there were colorable claims against them.
Yes, because that was actually an explicit violation of the auditing standards, right, in terms of communication to the audit committee.
Yes.
This is very, very interesting. Could you just, to finish up our conversation, could you just, give some pointers to our students about, what they can learn from this? What are the key takeaways from your perspective?
Well, this is not the only. I was called in by General Motors to do a report on General Motors, and after the circumstance involving the huge recalls, as to how and why that happened. And there are similarities in something which, both accountants and lawyers, I'm a lawyer, by practice and trade, and I involved in represent corporation, is the failure to see the larger picture, the tendency to live within a silo. My small part of this transaction is only to look at this small part of the transaction and to ignore the consequence of what it is that's taking place. And I think for professions who are charged with responsibility to upon which the public relies. When the public looks at those statements and they don't see them as technical, they see them as somehow an accountant has said, this is straight, this is good, this is honest, this is fair. And accountants need to look at these transactions and their picture and say, I need to make sure I'm fairly describing what's not taking place, not just technically what's within this little area. And they ought to be concerned about that. And I think when lawyers and accountants do more of that, we'll have less problems like Lehman Brothers in the future.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you say that, because one of the things I really emphasize in my class is about the importance of fair presentation and how that doesn't only involve compliance with GAAP. That the auditors need to take a step back and consider, are investors going to be misled by these financial statements? So anyway, I thank you so much for doing this interview with us. So the students are going to really appreciate it, I'm sure. Thank you once again, Tony.
A delight. I'm happy to be a participant. I'm glad to have the students involved, and I think it raises some really good questions, and it's great to have them thinking about these things. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you.